Benoit gave us the big European picture. In the spirit of our good and traditional neighborhood, I will try to add to this some regional aspects, also under the specific aspect that last year, in 2014, we could celebrate 25 years of the fall of the Iron Curtain, an event which Alexander Lamfalussy also was really some of the highlights of his life, as has been very much described in this new, very charming book on Alexander Lamfalussy, edited by his son. And in fact, I think that in 2014, we had been too much absorbed by our daily crisis and have not put enough emphasis on this really eminent events that took place in 1989. Because I think the fall of the Iron Curtain in 1989 and the largely peaceful implosion of the communist regimes marked the beginning of a new global era. And I really think we have to see this in a long-term perspective. And of course, this was followed by a number of important milestones. So EU enlargement in 2004, 2008, 2007, and 2013, Euro adoption in some of the countries of this region. And altogether, all these events have been parts of a highly successful story. And for me, it's very important that we are not only kind of looking at, as I said, our daily crisis and our problems that we have, but that we really see that what a huge achievement this has been, and that we see this as something, as a good thing, and see it in a longer term perspective. And in fact, just what we see today is, of course, that we have to see, if we think of events being just about 1,200 kilometers east of Budapest, should remind us that there are, of course, still deep and dangerous political divides in our continent, and that we should be very clear about how important it is to live in peace, and on the other hand, that wars not only destroy lives, but may wipe out living opportunities for living in prosperity for entire societies. And all these positive events, happened in Central and Eastern Europe. And this transition process in Central and Eastern Europe, in fact, had quite unique features. First, we see the impressive speed of liberalization. Second, of course, there is the geographical proximity of the countries of Central, Eastern, and Southeastern Europe to advanced high-income countries, which themselves had reached a high level of mutual economic integration via the EU. Third, and I think one should not forget this, the EU's willingness to embark on a courageous process of enlargement combined with substantial financial helps. And fourth, of course, the historical prerequisites that the countries of Central, Eastern, Southeastern Europe itself featured. So, for instance, that, of course, in many of these countries there is a pre-war experience of market economies, that these are countries with a high level of education, with mature institutional developments. So if I may show about some of these aspects in some stylized phases concerning this process of integration and transition. First, with regard to per capita income developments. And what you see here is, of course, different countries with also with some future perspectives for the years 2014 to 2018. And you see on the left side, let's say low-income countries, and on the right side, the high-income countries of these regions. What you see is that, of course, initially there had been a certain depression after this big substantial change. Then we have had quite a substantial upswing. And what is quite important is that this big worldwide crisis of the 2007-2008 was relatively well mastered by the countries of the region. And then, of course, we have very specific developments in different countries. So if you look at the higher income countries of the region, the number one, you see there has been quite substantial progress. We see with Slovenia being on the top, but with going down a bit now. Poland, perhaps you will not be able to read this in detail. Hungary, on this graph, has a rather low development in the years to come. These are IMF data or IMF expectations. I know and that the Hungarian government and the Hungarian central bank is more optimistic with regard to the next years. And I have to say I share this optimism. So therefore, just to be quite sure about the numbers I'm presenting to you. Of course, what you see is there is a general development upside. We do have, of course, quite large divergences between the economies, and I think this is also important to see. At the start, we had a rather similar development. Now we have a rather diverging development, and I think it is not possible nowadays to see Central Eastern and Southeastern Europe as a homogeneous region. And I have to say some outsiders, especially some American analysts, still do not understand that this is not just emerging Europe, but that this is a very differentiated situation, and that we have to look at each country on its own right. If we discuss what are the basic elements of these different developments, one is, of course, an importance of institutional elements. So, and I think this is very, very important. Of course, first it was the entry into the EU, which was a very strong signal, both internally and externally for the external actors. So to have a certain certainty about the rule of law, about basic institutions. What we also have is, of course, that what we have seen is a rapid increase in trade integration. First, of course, trade integration towards the Western economies, whereas the intra-trade more or less broke down immediately after the opening up. And so we see that this openness has increased really in a dramatic way. Exports and imports of the group of the CSEE countries had been 34% in 1989 of GDP. Now it's 116%. So you see in this 25 years, there has been a huge opening up of the economies, and this is a totally new game that we are in today. Something that also is, of course, of huge importance is the increase in foreign direct investment, which not only is something that has been a matter of the financial side, but which brought with it a huge amount of know-how, of knowledge of markets. And I think this has been some of the main reasons for positive developments in this region. And again, also is also one of the reasons for divergent developments in different countries of the region. Of course, there have been a number of vulnerabilities. And one of the vulnerabilities has been the current account. And what you see here is that we have had, in the midst of this development, current account deficits in some countries of more than 10% or so of GDP. By the way, of course, something not only relevant for Central and Eastern Europe, but also for Southern Europe. And I have to say that we have learned, I think, learned the hard way, that the current account is really an extremely important indicator for the long-term stability of an economy. And I would say for the EU as such, because it's not only that, of course, immediately it's current account deficits that may cause huge problems because they mean that you have to rely on external financing. One has to be aware that within this community, you have to have a certain equilibrium. That's what Benoit said about the macroeconomic surveillance system that we have. Also, huge current account surpluses pose a problem for the community. So I think we should try to have some kind of an equilibrium in this context. Again, speaking about Hungary in this context, you see that Hungary was able to move from a current account deficit to a current account surplus in this region. We have now, in general, lowered these deficits. And I have to say, this is, I think, one of the most important positive aspects that we see not only in this region, but for many European countries as such. We have, in this context, also the point of the involvement of foreign banks. And I think this involvement of foreign banks proved to be a very important element for providing, on the one hand, financial services in regions where there had been not much of a tradition in this side. It had been, of course, in some way, the expectation in these countries, if you think about the general economic theory of the Balassa-Samuelson theorem, that in such a process of reform, you would expect an appreciation of the currency. This expectation of the appreciation of the currency led to a strong lending in foreign currencies, which then proved to be a problem. And I have to say many central banks of the region, including the Austrian one, had been warning against this, and this is something where we now have to adjust to a situation that is, I think, viable in the long run, and I think we are on good underway in this way. But I think one has to be quite clear that overall, this strong role of foreign-owned banks had been a win-win situation for both sides. It had been a positive situation for the countries concerned because it gave them access to well-functioning, and let's say also not politically motivated lending activities. And on the other hand, of course, it was also a very important element for the banks of, let's say, for Austria, for other countries, to expand on a European scale. So I think it was overall a win-win situation. Now I think, in some way, one has to see, and I speak about the Austrian banks, that with this cannot be seen any longer just purely as foreign banks. These banking groups are developing into Central European banking groups. That means really with the home market, with integrated systems. If you look at the management, for instance, of the major Austrian banks, it is a multicultural, multinational management. And the idea is really to have not this old tradition of being foreign and home-owned, but to have really an integrated system of Central European well-functioning banking system. And I think this is something that is a positive perspective for this region, which is, of course, very much interconnected economically, which would have a number of additional features, for instance, of course, also, for instance, with regard to an integrated supervision. You know that we have now started in with the ECB, the SSM, the System of Mutual Supervision, which is open also to non-Euro member countries. And I think so these are chances that in some way we could take together, because I think this is something that would again enhance growth in a win-win situation. There is one aspect that we should not overlook in the general development, that of course parallel to the integration of Central and Eastern and Southeastern Europe, we had huge effects of globalization. If you look at the share of imports from China to the EU 15, in 1995, this share was 1.8%, and in 2013, it's 6.5%. And if you take it from Asia, it's 4% to 9.2%. And that, of course, has been something in some kind of a direct competition to this region. Many of the advantages of this region kind of were overtaken by the globalization effect coming from China. And this is an additional challenge that we have to meet all together. And also it may put some questions about what are the advantages of globalization vis-a-vis the advantages of some regional solutions, as it is basically the common market of the EU. And so I think this is also something where we might have to have some policy decisions in the future. So this was, I think, the situation that we have had in the last years. Then, of course, we had this huge economic crisis of 2007, 2008. Of course, this put a brake on the catching up process. But, as I said before, relatively, this region survived the crisis in a relatively good shape, and we have started the convergence process again. But it may have impacted also potential growth rates and therefore longer-term trends. And this is a discussion we have all over Europe. What is the future perspective for potential growth? And do we have this perspective of a long-term, lower-term growth? And you know that some international discussants even refer to situations of long-term stagnation. I think especially for this region, this is no perspective. And I don't see that it will be something that is of relevance. But we have to be aware that, of course, with lower growth differentials, the convergence process will be delayed substantially. So, and it's quite simple calculations that you can show that under an assumption of a growth differential of only 1 percentage point. That means this region growing only 1 percentage point higher than the rest of the EU. then full convergence may be reached only in the year 2060 around. So that means, of course, and you see, of course, with a 3% differential, it's 2033. So, of course, this is simple calculations, but one still has to see there is quite some long way to go. That means there is a need for long-term strategies. And again, of course, one has to be quite aware that this is a situation where we will have, again, very strong divergences between the different countries concerned. But in any case, I think one of the main issues is to revitalize the convergence process. This would mean a renewed focus on macroeconomic and financial stability, measures to rein in persistent deficits and debt, so measures to address high levels of bad loans in banks, so just following what Benoit had said before, and kickstart investment and credit growth. And again, we all know every investment is a bet on the future. So the first and most important element for investment is to have institutional safety, to have rule of law, to have clear property rights. This, I think, is a basis for investments that will come then. So I think, therefore, also structural problems should be addressed in areas such as the business investment climate, governance, access to credit, labor markets, public expenditure, prioritization, tax administration. And we have to be aware that this region, like all of Europe, but perhaps a bit even more than the rest of Europe, faces demographic challenges over the next 25 years. And so that also means that you have to adjust to this in time. So taken all together, I think one has to say Europe has undergone tremendous changes during the past 25 years. And I really wanted to use this occasion to remind us again what all had been happening in these 25 years, and that it was a positive development that we have seen. It's not only, of course, a change in the economic landscape, it's a change, or first had been a change in the political landscape. The countries on this continent have reached an unprecedented stage of integration, and one has to underline economic well-being. So all of us who remember how this region looked 25 years ago know what really happened in this time, and it's too easily forgotten. So there's a huge positive change that we have seen. I think this is a situation, and this was quite important, that proved broadly sustainable, also against the background of the biggest economic crisis since the 1930s. But of course, we also know that risks and vulnerabilities exist and, to a certain extent, have increased in recent times. So to fully capitalize on the further potential of European integration, unconventional thinking and bold reforms on a national as well as on a European level are needed. And I think Benoit gave some examples for this perspective that may be relevant. But I'm sure that if the right steps are taken, the coming 25 years will be just as successful and hopefully even more successful than the past 25 years. Thank you very much.